Thank you for inviting us today to discuss Bill S219. Given that this bill will disproportionately affect Iranian Canadians, it is important for our community to be part of the consultation process. This is why we appreciate being here with you today. The Iranian Canadian Congress, or ICC, is a grassroots, nonpartisan, and nonprofit community organization which seeks to safeguard and advance the interests of Canadians of Iranian heritage, a population estimated at 300,000 nationwide. My colleague and I are here on behalf of the ICC to present to you our views and concerns regarding Bill S219, the Non-Nuclear Sanctions Against Iran Act, and explain why the Senate should reject this bill in its entirety. The ICC is deeply concerned about this bill, which we see as not only contrary to government's stated policy of re-engagement with Iran, but also as an obstacle to Canada meeting its international obligations. Make no mistake, if enacted into law, this bill will kill any possibility of re-engagement with Iran. The present government has repeatedly stated its intention to re-engage with Iran and to reopen the Canadian mission in Tehran in a step-by-step approach. To this end, former Foreign Affairs Minister Bijan repeatedly stated in the House of Commons that, and I quote, "will engage with Iran step by step with open eyes." After more than a year of delicate and difficult negotiations with Iran, our diplomats are beginning to make some headway in re-engagement with Iran. These are extremely challenging negotiations for our diplomats, and both sides have concerns that need to be addressed. Canada requires assurances from Iran about safety and security of our diplomats, and Iranian officials have stated that they require assurances from Canada regarding the judicial immunity of their diplomats and common diplomatic assets. Instead of aiding in these difficult negotiations, Bill S219 is a step in the wrong direction. This bill not only leaves in place current obstacles in the path of re-engagement, but also raises more barriers by introducing more legal and bureaucratic complexities to the process. This is not the time for our legislature to impose seemingly ideological and symbolic restrictions on these negotiations. We must allow our diplomats to negotiate freely instead of forcing parameters and restrictions on already delicate diplomatic talks. The merits of diplomacy with Iran have been well proven. Another potentially catastrophic war in the Middle East was averted when world powers concluded the nuclear deal, JCPOA, over a year ago. Canada must play its part and give diplomacy a real chance and its full support. However, the deleterious effects that this bill has on our country's diplomatic processes is only one part of this bill, of why this bill is not in Canadians' best interests. Bill S219 endorses sanctions and a lack of diplomatic relations with Iran, the negative effects of which on both Canadian businesses and Iranian Canadians have been well documented. We'll now go into some of these issues. Iranian Canadians have suffered disproportionately in the years after the former government broke diplomatic relations and instituted strict sanctions on Iran. When relations were broken in 2012, Iranian Canadians suddenly found themselves unable to access consular services and were faced with considerable difficulty when attempting to acquire visitor visas for their relatives and family members still living in Iran. Ironically, Iranian Canadians have had to travel to Washington, D.C., where Iran maintains an interest section, to access consular services, an option which opens them up to President Trump's travel ban. Most importantly, the absence of a Canadian diplomatic mission in Iran has left Canadians visiting Iran vulnerable and without access to consular services in times of need. The other policy endorsed by this bill, the sanctions imposed by SEMA, created often insurmountable barriers for honest and hard-working Iranian Canadians. Many business owners who were dependent on the trade between Iran and Canada for their livelihood suddenly found their legitimate business activities rendered illegal. Additionally, banks refused to deal with those who had or were perceived to have any financial links to Iran, whether personal or business. This even resulted in the closure of the bank accounts of Iranian Canadians, including Canadian citizens, for no other reason than because they hold Iranian citizenship as well. For example, the bank account of an Iranian engineering student in Quebec was closed with only $700 in the bank account When he approached the bank, he was only told that his account was closed because he had an Iranian passport. Even today, after the government eased some of its sanctions on Iran in February 2016, some financial institutions are still applying the same rules, and we have received several reports from ordinary Iranian Canadians who have been subject to discrimination by banks. Bill S219 essentially endorses and seeks to perpetuate the policies which have caused so much suffering in the Iranian Canadian community. Not only will it derail diplomatic negotiations between Canada and Iran, depriving the community from the benefits of consular services and diplomatic representation, but it will also increase uncertainty and risk for financial institutions, further complicating the problem of banking discrimination and increasing the numbers of Iranian Canadians denied fundamental banking services. It is because of the suffering caused by these policies that an official parliamentary e-petition initiated by our organization asking the government to reestablish relations and re-engage with Iran has gathered nearly 16,000 signatures from across Canada. It is widely known that Canada has disagreements with Iran over its regional policies and has concerns over human rights conditions in Iran. And these concerns have been reaffirmed countless times by Canadian officials. Therefore, Bill S219 does not add any value in terms of informing the government of human rights concerns they have not already committed themselves to discuss with their Iranian counterparts. One major concern the Canadian government has in terms of human rights is the status of Canadian dual nationals arrested in Iran. In this respect, engagement allows Canadian diplomats to voice our concerns with Tehran and advocate for our citizens directly. To provide an example, following former Minister Dion's meeting last September with his Iranian counterpart, Foreign Minister Zarif, and through involvement of Italy and Oman, countries that both have diplomatic relations with Iran, Dr. Homa Houtfar was released and returned to Canada. This case shows how diplomacy and constructive engagement are the only way in which Canada effectively represent and protect its dual nationals. In fact, in a panel discussion in Toronto last week, Dr. Houtfar herself stated that she supports reestablishment of diplomatic relations between Canada and Iran. Having an embassy in Iran, she said, and I quote, is an important factor for protecting dual nationals and also for having a channel of communication with Iran. Adding, and I quote, I want to add my voice to those who support having an embassy in Iran. Dr. Houtfar emphasized that if the Canadian embassy was open at the time of her arrest, it could have helped to resolve her case more quickly. We still have a Canadian-linked prisoner in Iran, Saeed Malikpour, a Canadian permanent resident who has been in prison for the past 8 years. Through re-engagement with Iran, Canadian diplomats will have the opportunity to directly advocate for Mr. Malikpour's release with Iranian authorities. Now, our policy chair, Pouyan Tabasinjead, will talk about the effect of sanctions and the lack of diplomacy on Canada's businesses and its international standing.
Thank you, Bijan, and thank you again for having us here. So I'll just pick up where Bijan left off. Sanctions and the lack of diplomacy have not only harmed Iranian Canadians, as my colleague stated, but also Canadian businesses at large, who have not been able to access Iran's untapped market of 80 million people. To give you a sense of the amount of opportunity the Canadian economy is losing as a result of this policy, a 2014 study found that Canada lost between $850 million and $2.7 billion a year in exports as a result of these sanctions on Iran. In the meanwhile, Canada's G7 and NATO allies have been re-engaging with Iran both politically and economically since the JCPOA was put into effect. As sanctions have been eased on Iran, many international businesses, especially European companies, have entered the Iranian market, while Canadian companies have been lagging behind because of our lack of relations and the uncertainties surrounding our sanctions regime, otherwise known as SEMA. For example, in the first 9 months of 2016 alone, the European Union's trade with Iran has increased by 63%. Several major contracts have been signed over the past 12 months, including major deals with Boeing and Airbus worth billions. After Canada eased sanctions on Iran in February of 2016, Canadian business leaders and representatives, including the president of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, have shown considerable optimism towards trade with Iran. There is opportunity for Canada and Iran in a variety of sectors, including aerospace, railroads, oil and gas, and technologies. These are all sectors where Canadian businesses excel and can benefit significantly from trade with Iran. This fact has in fact been corroborated by Canadian companies themselves. By way of example, in an interview with the Canadian press in October of 2016, the CEO of Bombardier said that the Montreal-based plane and train maker sees opportunities to sell rail services and jets, including the C-series airliners, to Iran. Canada must encourage its businesses to enter the Iranian market, rather than legislating against these activities with Bill C219, which only increases uncertainties and puts our companies in legal risk. Re-engagement with Iran will not only benefit Canadian businesses, but it will also increase Canada's influence in the world. As we enter perhaps the most challenging international environment since the Cold War with the election of the new U.S. administration, our country has the unique opportunity to position itself as a global leader by playing a part in solving perhaps some of the most important challenges in international relations today, namely nuclear nonproliferation and stability in the Middle East region. By pursuing a path of diplomacy and engagement with Iran, Canada can position itself as an unbiased diplomatic broker in the world and gain influence beyond that accorded to it by its status as a middle power. In sum, we repeat that this bill is nothing but an attempt to derail the process of re-engagement. It is endorsing the same failed policies which have harmed Iranian Canadians, Canadian businesses, and our international standing as an impartial promoter of dialogue. We therefore ask the honourable members of the Senate, once again, to reject this bill in its entirety and safeguard the interests of Canadians, Canadian businesses, build Canada's international standing, and advance the cause of world peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ahmadi, and thank you, Mr. Tabasinjead, for your presentations. Now, Senator would like to have some questions. I start with Senator Housakas.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here with us today. And first and foremost, I want to highlight as well the tremendous contribution and success of the Iranian community in Canada. We're very fortunate to have the few 100,000 Canadians of Iranian descent who have made a great contribution in science and academia and in business. And of course, you know, they are Iran's loss and our gain. I listened very attentively to your comments, and I just want to, before I get into my question, highlight my point of view that, as far as I'm concerned, the biggest harm to the Iranian Canadian community is an extremist Islamic fundamentalist government in Iran. That's first and foremost. And I think Canada has had a long history of engagement with nations and individuals that don't share the same values that we do. But in this particular instance, you're talking about a government that has systematically abused and disregarded fundamental human rights. The list is long. They have no respect for fundamental rule of law. They have continuously been belligerent in a region that is already explosive in supporting state-run terrorism. They have called for the destruction of the democratic state of Israel on an ongoing basis. So the question I have is, when you take that into context, the question I have to you is, where is the silver lining you see of the potential between us engaging in a diplomatic relationship with a country that has shown no impetus to respect the rules and the way of life that we respect, not to mention the fact that they don't believe in fundamental freedom of religion, which we cherish our fundamental freedoms in this country. So my question fundamentally is, with all that preamble, is you talk about the economic risks, the economic losses to the Iranian Canadian business community and our business community at large. But how far, where do you draw the line, and how far do we go in compromising the beliefs and fundamental principles of human rights and other fundamental rules of law that we respect as Canadians? Where do we draw the line? Where do we train in our principles for commercial gain? And we do it on a regular basis. I agree. There's a number of countries that don't share our values, but yet we engage with trade. But where do you move that line, and where do you place that line with Iran and Canada?
Thank you, Honourable Senator, for your question and also for your remarks recognizing the contributions of the Iranian Canadian community to Canada's multicultural society. That's a great question. If we only talk to those people who agree with us, agree with our values, look at the world from our perspective, and respect those values, honestly, we will end up talking to very few countries. Let's not forget that even during the Cold War, we maintained our relations with Soviet Union. So having diplomatic relations by no means, as former Minister Stéphane Dion has repeatedly mentioned before as well during his time, by no means, it does not mean that Canada and Iran agree with each other. There are concerns, as you mentioned, regarding regional policies, as you mentioned, regarding human rights issues. And by no means we're talking about compromising our values. What we're talking about is that engagement is a better way, is a better strategy to address these concerns, whether it is about human rights issues or it's about regional policies of Iran that we do not agree with. It is better to re-engage with Iran diplomatically, to create a channel of communication with that government so that directly we can sit across the table from them and talk to them about these disagreements that we have.
I appreciate that, and like I said, engagement is fundamental, but you have to have check marks along the way in the process. So when you set those check marks from a Canadian perspective, and we're a Canadian parliamentary committee, where do you draw that line? We are going to show goodwill by engaging, but what are our expectations from the person we're engaging with, and what are the timelines of those expectations? When it comes to issues of democracy, when it comes to issues of human rights, when it comes to issues of imprisoning prisoners in Iran without due process, not to mention just brutal abuse, physical abuse of people who oppose the regime. Time and time again, you see international figures and Iranians who stand up for fundamental human rights and freedom of speech in Iran getting persecuted and tortured. It's hard to engage with a nation that is as brutal as that. So my point is, if we start the process of engagement, and the government has already taken that position, you as a Canadian, especially of Iranian descent, where do you draw the line? What are your expectations from Iran's point of view? Which part of the football field do they meet us?
So if we want to talk about our expectation first is for our government to change the policy of the past, which was to isolate Iran and not to talk to them at all, and to re-engage with Iran. Because that approach, we believe, the alternative is to just maintain the status quo. And that approach, that strategy, it's now evident that it hasn't produced any positive results with respect to human rights, with respect to regional disagreements that we have with Iran. So what we expect our government to do is to re-engage with Iran. The issue with this bill, now if we want to get back to this bill, is that this bill will block that opportunity of re-engagement with Iran. So instead of imposing through parliamentary restrictions, imposing these bureaucratic and legal complexities to a process that is already, to a negotiation that is already difficult with Iran, we better leave this with our diplomats in Global Affairs Canada to allow them to directly talk to Iran and actually put those benchmarks, put those conditions that you're talking about, ask for those assurances and reassurances that we need about safety of our diplomats, about our dual national safety, about all these issues. But these issues have to be addressed in these negotiations directly by our diplomats instead of specific restrictions imposed on these negotiations by the Parliament. We believe this bill will impose these restrictions and will only derail the negotiations that are already ongoing.
Could you put that one for the second round?
Sure.
Because we have a long list of senators asking questions. Senator Saint-Germain.
I will ask my question in French, so if you need the translation, I will move a few seconds to... Merci.
Thank you. I would also like to congratulate you for your dynamism and the dynamism of your community through your presence here this morning. I was touched by the example you gave where a young Iranian student had his assets frozen, his assets of $700 in this case. it would seem to me that this regrettable example does not have ties with Canada's sanctions, but has ties with the fact that Canadian institutions and Canadian organizations are ill-informed. There should be more awareness raised about Iranian Canadians. Could we not have been able to rectify this issue by other means than legislation? The example you give has no ties with the bill, as far as I'm concerned. Now, with regards to renewing diplomatic ties and exchanges, the issue now is to find a solution whereby Canadian Iranians will not be victims, and the same needs to be true for Iranians in Iran. Do you not believe that diplomacy does not have too many limits in that respect?
So I'll answer the banking question. I think Bijan will answer the question. So if I understand correctly, your question was whether Canadian institutions are merely misinformed, malinformed,
Yes.
and that's the main issue here. There's obviously there's an issue of that, and we've been in contact with Canadian banks about why exactly they're rejecting Iranians, and it's happening on a daily basis. And we're talking about Canadians who've been here almost all their lives, and there's for tens of years, and they're still having these issues for very small sums of money. And there's obviously the issue of misinformation, and they don't know, unfortunately, exactly what the rules are. But the problem is that there's a lot of uncertainty. Really, from the bank's point of view, it's about risk, right? It's about legal risk and financial risk, which are the two are tied together. We believe that this bill introduces more uncertainty. So as the banks might be reconsidering entering, allowing Iranian Canadians to be banked again, stopping the process of debanking and reversing it, this bill introduces more uncertainty, introduces more risk from their perspective. They're not here to, it's not about human rights, and they're not necessarily here to
It's about
help.
business and money.
It's about business and money, and it's a risk for them. It's all about legal risk for them. So from our perspective, this bill introduces more legal risk for Iranian Canadians, opening them up to more discrimination by banks, or the ongoing ones at least.
I'll try answering your second question. I may ask you to repeat part of it if I didn't answer it. Please repeat it. I have to repeat some what I mentioned about the previous question as well, that there are two ways in front of us. One is to re-engage with Iran, and through diplomatic means, through diplomatic channels, we address the concerns about dual nationals, about the human rights condition with Iran, about disagreements over Iran's regional policies. The second approach is the approach that we've been taking in the previous years and under former government. It was established to isolate Iran, not to talk to Iran, not to have any diplomatic dialogue. Our European allies right now are following the first route. United States, for the nuclear agreement, they followed the first path. They talked to Iran, and that resulted into the nuclear agreement.
Yeah.
There were the sanctions, but till there was no negotiation, long negotiations between the P5+1 countries, it didn't result into JCPOA, the international agreement. Therefore, what we are suggesting here is that the only path that will result, because we tested the other path, we tested the path of trying to isolate and not talk. So we have to give the other path now a chance as well, and see how that will help. And we believe, based on what our EU partners are doing, we believe that that will have better and more positive results. If I may add one more thing, is about Iran's human rights record, and it's important. It is significant that we do not ignore completely any improvement, any very slow, but promising improvements and steps that have been taken by moderate factions in Iran towards improving human rights condition in the country. And unfortunately, many times, these small steps are being ignored. The proposal of a Bill of Citizens' Rights by President Rouhani and efforts in the Iranian parliament, ongoing efforts to remove the death penalty for drug-related crimes, are examples of attempts by moderate forces to improve respect for human rights in Iran. And these improvements have been confirmed by Ahmed Shahid, who is the special rapporteur for human rights in the United Nations. Therefore, if we allow the path of diplomatic engagement, if we give it a chance, it may result into better improvements. We will have a chance to sit across Iranian authorities and to address the differences and the concerns that we have on different issues.
Yes, a small question. Would it be enough? Can't we add other means? If it's not a legislation, it might be something else, but you've said it will be long. In the meantime, people will continue to have their human rights infringed. Isn't there more to do at the same time and more rapidly?
First of all, let's not forget that we're already doing a major action with respect to human rights, that we have been doing it for, I don't remember the exact number of years, but for several years now, and that's through UN path, basically addressing some of the human rights concerns with Iran through the UN resolution that Canada introduces. However, if that is not completed or complemented with negotiations, with engagement and talks, it will not bring positive result. It will just be an action in the UN, and then there is no talk by Canada with Iran to actually ask for improvements so that the issues raised in that UN resolution can be addressed. So that, I believe, is the next step, is the next action. However, this bill that is in front of us, it's not about these actions. It's about some legal complexities attaching some more conditions to CIMA sanctions, which will actually make us, and this is a very important point, it may actually make us non-compliant with UN Resolution 2231, which was passed in the United Nations Security Council after the JCPOA was signed. So it is only asking for some conditions to be added to those CIMA sanctions, and this bill will essentially derail any path of re-engagement, and that's our main issue. We do not have disagreements about benchmarks or addressing human rights concerns, but these issues can be addressed through the diplomatic means and through Global Affairs Canada instead of restrictions from the Parliament. Another important issue that I would like to add is we should be very, our parliamentarians, we believe, should be very concerned about the precedent or kind of the double standard that this bill will create. The conditions or the issues that are mentioned, even in the name of this bill or under the specific provisions, are actually issues and concerns that you can find in many other countries beside Iran. In the region, let's bring up the example of Saudi Arabia. We actually sold, I believe it was $15 million arms deal with Saudi Arabia. We closed that deal. Therefore, it's very dangerous and risky to put a bill together that other countries that we have friendly relations with, not only relations, friendly relations with, meet some of these violations and concerns that are in this bill. So if we want to actually put this bill, I believe we have to rewrite it and include all those other countries beside Iran that meet the same issues. Otherwise, it is a double standard. It's not, and it will set a precedent that in future we may actually require to put the same kind of bill and impose same kind of restrictions on other countries as well. And I say again, many of these countries we have friendly relations with them. It's not only that we have diplomatic relations with them. Here we're trying to establish relations, just diplomatic relations with Iran. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Saint-Germain. Next, Senator Wu.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I'm from British Columbia and Vancouver in particular. I live on the North Shore where there's a very large community of Iranian Canadians. So this bill is an issue that they will be watching very closely. I want to just make a clarification and to see if you agree. Many of the problems that you see Iranian Canadians currently facing, of course, have to do with the current implementation of the CIMA regulations. This bill is an addition to those regulations. It increases the number of prohibitions and the number of identified organizations that would be subject. So we can't solve all of the problems that you have identified, even if we reject this bill in its entirety. Just a point of clarification. I want to get to the nub of the issue. I'm a big fan of engagement, and your central point is this. If we pass this bill, we will jeopardize, in fact, we will jettison, we will totally sink the ship of engagement with Iran. I want you to tell us in more detail and with more reasoning as to why you believe this is the case. Can we not walk and chew gum at the same time? Is it not possible for us to poke the Iranians in the eye with this bill and still have them come to us and say, yeah, we'll open an embassy both ways and we'll continue to have this path of diplomatic re-engagement?
Thank you for your good question, Senator Wu. And we actually received a couple of communication from your constituents from British Columbia as well. There is a large Iranian-Canadian population in British Columbia, and especially in Vancouver, and they were concerned about this bill specifically. About your question, I would like to mention a couple of points, and maybe some of them I'm repeating, but I will sort of make some clarifications. The ongoing negotiations are difficult, and there are already barriers in front of these negotiations based on public information that is available from both governments. So on one side, Canada, we have concerns specifically about if we want to reopen our mission in Iran, we have concern about the safety of our diplomats. On the side of Iran, this past week, the spokesperson for Iranian Minister of Foreign Affairs has said that, for the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has said that they are open to re-engage with Canada, but they have concerns about the judicial immunity of their diplomats and any diplomatic asset that they need to bring to Canada, for example, to reopen the embassy or a consular office. This bill sends the wrong signal, and that's the main issue. It sends the wrong signal to these negotiations. Simply, the message to Iran is that instead of trying to resolve the barriers that already exist, these barriers already exist through actually some of the restrictions imposed by, I believe, previous parliament. Instead of that, we are imposing further and additional barriers. So that's one issue. The other issue is that attaching these, and I briefly touched on this issue, attaching these additional sanctions that are suggested in S219 will make our CIMA sanctions non-compliant with UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which will be another problem that Iran will have with this bill. And I can get into more detail about that if you would like. And the third point that I would like to point out to is that we should not overestimate, and this is unfortunate, I wish that we had more leverage in these negotiations with Iran, but we should not overestimate our leverage with Iran here. I would love for Canada if we had more, basically, leverage, we would be able to impose more restrictions or ask for more, but we don't have it here. The international community is engaging with Iran, politically and economically. Iran is doing business with our European allies, so they're not dependent on business with Canada. Therefore, they can afford to continue with the status quo without relations. In fact, I warn that we should expect Iran to suspend negotiations. We should expect Iran to suspend negotiations if this bill is passed, because they can afford to actually play this a bit tough and say that, and basically make an example that if these restrictions happen, we do not want to engage with a country. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator. Senator Corey.
And thank you very much for being here. I think I quoted you yesterday at the meeting for a letter written when it was actually written by Maziar Sarafi, who then at the end said, for your information, here's the name of the president, and I said that the letter was from you. So, but basically, you've said the same things that he said. Thank you very much for being here, and it's helpful to hear from the Canadian-Iranian community and the ramifications that you feel would be brought on them if this bill is in fact passed. I think our witness yesterday actually made an excellent point, in that there's a big difference between the Iranian people and the Iranian government, which supports terrorism and certainly commits human rights violations, but don't extend that to punish all of the Iranian Canadians or all of the Iranian people. So thank you very much for what you've told us. And our witness yesterday, who personally was tortured in Iran, also felt that closing of the embassies was very harmful to helping people in Iran. So she certainly made the same point that you've made. So will this bill make it more difficult for Iranian Canadians? You've already said it'll block re-engagement. You've already said that Iran has already got dealings with a lot of other countries, so if Canada's left out, then they're not really going to get that concerned about it, but it will certainly hurt Iranian Canadians. So I guess, how do we find a solution to, and it's a follow-up, I guess, to Senator Wu's question, how do we find a solution to the human rights violations by the government of Iran without causing difficulties for the people of Iran and for Iranian Canadians? And I guess I'll just ask another question. This committee dealt a few weeks ago with the Magnitsky bill, which was drawn up because of an incident in Russia, but the bill itself is not specific to Russia. It actually talks about human rights violations overall, whereas this bill is specific only to Iran. So do you feel that the Magnitsky bill would in fact cover any of the people in Iran who are committing violations?
Unfortunately, I'm not aware of the details of the, I believe it's called, the full name is Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, if I'm correct. I'm not fully aware of all the details, but again, the main concern that we have with this bill, regardless of each of the provisions, which there are actually concerns with each of the provisions, at least some of them. However, it's in entirety, our issue with it is that this will block re-engagement. And then if we cannot re-engage with Iran, we will not be able, we have to continue with the status quo, with the strategy that the former government implemented. And that strategy definitely did not address the concerns that, for example, the witness yesterday brought up, and all the concerns about human rights condition in Iran, regional policy disagreements. Another issue that I would like to add is that a lot of times there's this, they say that Iranian government and Iranian people are different. Well, these re-engagement, these relations are between the governments. There's no way, there are ways through cultural exchanges, through university and research exchanges for people to communicate, but even those, when there is no at least diplomatic relationship, at least diplomatic communication between those two countries, those areas are affected significantly as well. So at least there has to be some level of engagement between these two governments so that then people can actually talk to each other more and engage with each other more. We have many Iranian students here, not dual nationals, but Iranian international students in Canada. Those are good ways to engage with people of Iran. Cultural exchanges, those are very good ways to engage with Iran, with the people of Iran. But there has to be some level of diplomatic engagement with Iran. With respect to one issue that you mentioned about human rights, we believe that Prime Minister Trudeau, when he traveled to China, the approach that he was talking about, and I don't remember the exact quote, but the approach that he talked about in China, about addressing the issues of human rights, is the path forward, not to address, not only about Iran, but about all countries, Saudi Arabia, other countries, many countries that have human rights violation issues. First of all, I believe that we really need to address this double standard because it actually hurts our opportunity and our power in influencing change. So that's one thing. But then Prime Minister Trudeau said it very well, that we have to, first of all, recognize that there are human rights issues even in Canada, and then communicate our human rights concerns with these countries, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, many other countries that have human rights violations. So we believe in that approach. We believe that engagement and communicating these concerns are the best way moving forward.
I wonder if you could expand a little bit on, you touched that if this bill is passed, it wouldn't be in compliance with a UN resolution, and I don't remember the number of the UN resolution, but I wonder if you would expand on that just a little bit.
Sure. So remaining sanctions on Iran under CIMA, according to information from Global Affairs Canada, are aimed to restrict Iran's access to sensitive goods from Canada, especially with respect to nuclear technology and the development of ballistic missiles. Based on information provided from Global Affairs, these restrictions are based on UN-Iran regulations. After UN Security Council Resolution 2231, approving the implementation of JCPOA, Canada followed its international obligations and modified its sanctions on Iran in February 2016. While Canada was not, and this issue was actually brought up by some of the witnesses before as well, that Canada was not involved in JCPOA negotiations between P5+1 countries. However, there is an issue, and that is the nuclear agreement was confirmed by UN Security Resolution 2231 in July 2015. And as it states in the resolution, member states are obligated under Article 25 of the Charter of United Nations to accept and carry out the Security Council's decisions. UNSC calls upon all member states, regional organizations to implement basically the provisions of JCPOA and refrain from actions that undermine implementation of commitments under the JCPOA. Whether the remaining sanctions, even these ones that right now exist, even these remaining sanctions, whether they are fully in compliance with UN Security Council Resolution 2231 or not, is a matter that may actually require further investigation. And I know there is a review of CIMA. I believe it was either recently completed or is still ongoing, and it may require legal experts to look at it. However, it's evident that based on information from the Government of Canada, each of the remaining sanctions under CIMA are based on requirements of the UN Security Council decision about nuclear or ballistic missile technology. Therefore, additional conditions that are proposed under Bill S219 to be attached to CIMA sanctions are not compliant because they're not in UNSC 2231.
Thank you, Chair.
Senator Corey. Senator Bayak.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I want to say that I share all of Leo's positive comments about the Iranian people. The people are completely different from the government, and I think every Canadian recognizes that. A prominent Liberal, Warren Kinsella, wrote an amazing column 2 days ago about the anti-refugee, anti-immigrant sentiment that's sweeping the planet and how we have to have objective debates. I would encourage everyone to read his column. It says we need to talk. We need to not make it political. Let's be people. Two of his most important points were that it's time for us to, let me just, get it more clear. He said there's 3 questions we have to ask, and I'd like to ask your organization that with full disclosure and no controversy. Do you want Sharia law in Canada, yes or no? Do you believe in the equality of men and women in Canada under the Charter, yes or no? And do you believe in the State of Israel? He says it's imperative that Canadians, 2/3 of them, want us to be more vigilant in who we talk to, how we associate with nations who support terror and have human rights problems, and whether we want those values to come to Canada. Please read the column, and those are your answers are yes or no. I understand Sharia law, I understand the Charter, and I support the State of Israel. So your answers are yes or no. Thank you.
I want to actually write them down. And
do you believe in Sharia law in Canada? Do you believe in the equality of men and women in Canada under our Charter? And do you support the State of Israel? Thank you.
Yeah. First of all, Honourable Senator, this is a very surprising question that is not that has nothing to do with the proposed bill, but I will gladly answer that. The first question, and I believe this is not an issue even for our organization to respond. It's a very personal question. Our organization believes in the law that we have in Canada, and so it's not Sharia law. We believe in the Canadian legal system and Canadian law about equality of women and men. Definitely, there is no question about that. It's actually in the constitution of our organization that we believe in the Charter of Rights, Charter of Individual Rights and Freedoms. It is in our constitution of our organization, Iranian-Canadian Congress. And your third question was supporting Israel. In what respect do you mean that question? That's a very general question. State of Israel is recognized by international organizations, United Nations. We do not have any agenda or mission to even question that. Do I, as a person, support all the policies of the current government of Israel? I cannot even say that about the government of Canada, my government, that I support all the policies of the current government of Canada, while I agree with many of them. And definitely, I will answer this as an individual, not as our organization. I do not agree with some of the policies of the current government of Israel, but that your question is about the state of Israel. And we do not have any, there's no question about that. Yes, the state of Israel is recognized under international law.
Thank you. It was relevant, Chairman, to the bill that we're looking at today because of the feelings of Canadians in Mr. Kinsella's column. 2/3 of Canadians want us to be more vigilant about the organizations that we speak with, whether their values and beliefs are shared by Canadians, and whether this kind of a bill helps or hurts the belief of the people that we're talking to. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bayak. Senator Mauer.
Thank you. Thank you again for coming to speak to us. You certainly provided a different perspective, particularly from the view of Iranian Canadians. I had two questions, so maybe I'll just go over one first. I'd be curious, what percentage of Iranian Canadians do your organization represent? And would there be another point of view amongst other Iranian Canadians? That was one. The second question is, in recent periods, it's obvious to, at least to me, that Iran has been moving on a continuum to re-engage with the world and re-engage with the West in particular, maybe not the world, but certainly re-engage with the West. And you're a lot closer to what's happening on the ground in Iran. So as Iranian Canadians, do you see a shift in human rights? You mentioned some very, very modest shifts in human rights, but do you see other shifts in their rhetoric and their recognition of the rule of law? Do you see any other changes in whichever direction, or do you see no change?
So about your first question, same as all different communities, our community is not a monolithic community as well. There are different perspectives and different views. The Iranian Canadian Congress is the political advocacy organization in the Canadian-Iranian community that aims to advance the interests of the community. There is no way for us to exactly say by percentage point what is the percentage of people we represent, but we have and we can say that we are one of the major organizations and the only organization that works with respect to advocacy for the rights of Canadian Iranians in Canada. I believe that there was a parliamentary petition that we prepared and submitted to the House of Commons. A copy of it is with I believe, the clerk in the committee. The copy can be provided to you. And that petition is about a specific issue of re-engaging with Iran, re-establishing relations. And it outlines these issues that we talked about of how the policy of isolation has affected our community. We received nearly 16,000 signatures, and that put us in the top 10 electronic petitions of the House of Commons, all of them that exist on the website of Parliament of Canada today. And those signatures are from all around, across Canada. So that shows how this request, how this action has huge support in our community. Large number of Iranian Canadians support this policy, and we've been able to outreach to them and ask them to take action regarding this issue. There was a second question, I believe, as well, which you can. Sure.
We also undertook a series of consultations with members of the community, open consultations, consultations with members or leaders of the community, nonprofit organizations, academics, etc. And what we found, and it was interesting, and it kind of spurred us on to make this petition, to initiate this petition, is that in every single consultation, this issue was the first issue as far as they were concerned. So we didn't make this petition willy-nilly. We wanted to make sure this was something that was supported by our community and by our constituents. And what we found consistently when we talked to large numbers of Iranian Canadians is that they supported this action. And I think the number of signatures that this petition received at the end is kind of speaks for itself, because this was a petition that was only sponsored through our own networks, through Iranian networks, and it's more or less self-explanatory.
I would like to let the members of the committee know that the petition to the government from the organizations represented by Mr. Bijan Ahmadi and Mr. Pouyan, we have only in English, is here, and that's the reason why we're supposed to have it bilingual so that we can distribute to all members. But now we have only in French. But all members, if you want it, you let us know, and then the page they'll give it to you, the petitions on this one. Thank you, Mr. Mauer. Next, Senator Toulajan.
Thank you, Chair. I apologize for being late, so I might, this might be a question somebody might have already asked, but I just want to get back to what Senator Housakas said and your response to him, where you say that we should let the diplomats and the bureaucrats, handle, the exchange of or the talks, what's going on. But as parliamentarians, there are things that we can say and we can do that the diplomats and the bureaucrats might not be able to. So is it my understanding that we should start talking to Iran, without having any conditions attached? I mean, I agree with you that, the countries that we're friends with who have, similar issues, we should be raising those issues because, after all, we are Canada and we're known throughout the world for, our stance on human rights. So is that the sense I'm getting from you?
So we believe that this bill will basically will block any opportunity of re-engagement with Iran. That's what I've repeated a couple of times, and the reason is that is the main reason why we're against this bill and why we're requesting you to reject this bill, because it will not allow us to move forward anymore and to re-engage with Iran. With respect to the conditions, Government of Canada, Global Affairs Canada, they have the powers needed, the authority needed under current law, under current regulations, to address the issues, to bring up these concerns that we have with Iran in the diplomatic conversations. They do not need any more restrictions. They do not need there is no special authority that this bill is providing to the Government of Canada that they're, for example, even asking for it, or that they need to be able to re-engage with Iran. So step one is to re-engage with Iran, to communicate these concerns that we have with them. We have very capable diplomats. They have the authority, they have the power they need under current regulations and laws, and they will be able to address these issues in these negotiations.
Okay,
please. Very short. Just in regard to Senator Bayak's question about Sharia law, don't you feel that as the Muslim community, it's a dead issue? As a Muslim, I don't know anyone who wants Sharia law, especially the women. We're very happy with the laws of the land. And, in the community, I don't think there's that conversation is taking place anywhere. That's my sense. So I don't know what your sense is. I just want you to put that on the record.
Did we say anything that was about Sharia law that brought up this question?
No, I'm just saying Senator Bayak had asked about Sharia law.
Oh, okay.
So I want to sort of put it on the record that as a Muslim, it's a dead conversation. I don't hear anyone asking for Sharia law in Canada. Is that your experience also?
That is our experience. Our organization, we have to note that it's a non-religious organization, so we do not even get engaged in conversations and issues that are related to religions. But we, especially in the Iranian Canadian community that we interact with, we do not see any sort of appetite for the Sharia law and for this issue.
Could I just add something? I'm not saying that there was any ill intention behind the question, but it makes me uncomfortable when these types of questions are asked from people that come from Muslim communities, and it's a little, it comes from certain strains of Islamophobia, etc. I mean, I'm not saying that, but it makes me uncomfortable when such questions are asked.
Senator Toulajan, we have 3 more senators, and then we go second round with time permits. Senator Bowie.
I wanted to respond.
Oh, you want the response?
Yes, please. Yeah, I just wanted to respond to that because I agree with you. I have 3 best friends who are Muslim, a woman and 3 men, 4 of them altogether, who told me those 3 questions are absolutely pertinent to the discussions that we have to have in Canada. the objective discussion because there is a huge commitment to Sharia law still in Canada. It went to the government of Ontario just a couple of years ago. They voted on it, and they say that Reform Muslims who want to come to Canada and be Canadians don't want Sharia law in Canada. So it's a very important question. I'm very pleased that Salma put it on the record. Thanks, Salma.
Thank you, Senator Bea. Senator Bovey.
I want to thank you very much for coming and for your presentation. And I have to say I was pleased to hear you talk about cultural and university exchanges, and it won't be a surprise to anybody in this room that I feel those are very beneficial. And indeed, Universities Canada has been here in Ottawa this week, and many of them I spoke to talked about the importance of global exchanges like this. That said, I want to take our question and flip it another way. You have talked a bit about the human rights issues. If Bill S219 was approved, do you think the sanctions what do you think the sanctions might really achieve, and would they serve to improve the situation for citizens in Iran? If you could address this a little bit, I think it would give the other side to today's conversation.
So if this bill is enacted, as we said, we believe that the path of re-engagement with Iran, that's the first achievement, that the path of re-engagement with Iran will be blocked, and we will not be able, most likely, to re-engage with Iran. In terms of sanctions, we know that sanctions are only effective when there is international consensus on any issue that sanction is addressing. Therefore, even these sanctions, if we implement them, there is no international consensus at this point to impose sanctions on Iran. Therefore, they are, as one of the previous witnesses in favor of this bill even mentioned, these are symbolic sanctions that are being proposed. I do not believe it's only symbolic. I believe that actually there might be an intention to block the path of re-engagement by bringing these bureaucratic complexities and legal complexities up, and it will basically block the path of re-engagement. The other issue that will be created are the problems that have been created for Iranian Canadians. Pouyan, my colleague, talked about the banking issue, about the consular access to consular services, both here for Iranian Canadian dual nationals and for people, Canadians who travel to Iran, to have access to consular services at times of need. So if that path of re-engagement is blocked, then we will not be able to provide these services, and these issues will remain for our community. With respect to the issue of engagement between people, universities, cultural exchanges, I will just explain a personal experience that I had. I was talking to a charitable organization in Canada that does work with different countries. I was trying to, now that sanctions are eased, I was trying to convince them maybe there can be some cooperations with charitable organizations in Iran. There are many charitable nonprofit organizations active in Iran. Iran has a very strong civil society that is active, and it has been around for a very long time, probably 100 years or more. The civil society has been active. The civic society has been engaged. The charitable organization simply told me that because of all these restrictions that exist right now, even though sanctions might not be specifically on humanitarian issues, the cost, the complexity of engaging with Iran is too high at this point. So maybe we have to revisit it at a later time. So these are the issues. These are the problems. Go ahead.
Thank you,
just to answer your question directly about the effect of sanctions on Iranians themselves, I think most observers would agree that it's been nothing but disastrous on Iranian civilians. It's been disastrous. In fact, and that they even might constitute a human rights violation in and of themselves. And I'm citing a report by the International Institute for Peace, Justice, and Human Rights, a 2013 report that said that sanctions had disastrous effects on the Iranian citizens and violated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we're talking about access to medicine was reduced, prices went up very high to the point that it was unaffordable for large sections of the population. I mean, just disastrous, horrible implications for Iranians. So we shouldn't fool ourselves in any sense that this is good for the Iranian people, because it's not.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have 10 more minutes, but we have 3 more senators. So, Senator Cruz.
Thank you so very much, Chairman. I would like to thank the witnesses for appearing before us, and I would especially like to thank them for their clarity of mind, and also I would say for their remarkable objectivity and dispassionate dialogue in the face of a bill which could be described as offensive. And I hate to tell colleagues, but I have no intention to thwart it, none whatsoever. And I'm not open to persuasion on this point. I'd like you to know, gentlemen, that I was brought to the Senate by Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Trudeau the Elder. You know, William Pitt the Elder and William Pitt the Younger, there's Trudeau the Younger. I was brought here by the Elder, and I had the opportunity of knowing this man and having deep respect for him. Whatever his failings may have been, and whatever his shortcomings were, it does not matter. The world viewed Mr. Trudeau as an agent, as an agent of international dialogue. And Mr. Trudeau personally believed in this, that unless you keep doors open and keep conversations going, you will not be able to influence anyone, any other country. And I'm a lot older than you, and I'm older than most of you here, but I remember very clearly when Mr. Trudeau broke the barriers and opened the doors with China. And that was a huge issue at the time, and many were afraid and shocked, you know, maybe the red communists were going to come and take over Canada or something, but it succeeded. It succeeded, and China has taken a good place, I believe, in the world. Having said that, I just want to be crystal clear here that I disagreed with the previous government termination of diplomatic relationships with Iran. I thought it was short-sighted and ill-considered, and I wish it had never happened. And diplomacy is a strange animal. You know, they say money is a coward; it flees in the face of challenges, but not diplomacy. Diplomacy is supposed to be there, steady, like a steady hand, ready to reach out to the moment when there's an opportunity to dialogue. Because dialogue at the end of the day will avoid disaster, I think, and even wars. So having said that, I think that this bill is troubling. When we get into the details of studying, I think that will become a lot more clear. But the major point I want to make on the bill is that this bill is not properly the subject of a statute of Canada.
We have 2 more senators.
You know, Senator, I must tell you, I don't have to answer a question. Committee meetings and these hearings are not question and answer periods. They're for commentary as well. So I encourage you to be generous. Thank you. So I just wanted to make those points to you. Canada, the Parliament of Canada is the Parliament of Canada. It's not the Parliament of the world. And in our constitutional system, these decisions are the exclusive purview of what we call the royal prerogative powers, which means the foreign minister, the king or the queen's minister of foreign affairs. Never mind the change in to global affairs. They're all called foreign ministers. And this, we have trenched on that prerogative, and we are, quite frankly, out of order, in my view. I hope I haven't spoken too strongly, and I hope I haven't shocked some of you, but we must make it our business to stay on the ground that is ours. And our business Our jurisdiction as the Parliament of Canada is purely domestic. The Parliament of Canada has no jurisdiction internationally. And these bills are coming before us seeking international jurisdiction. We can't give it to them because we don't have it to give it to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Coons.
Love you.
Senator Dawson.
I was a member of Parliament with Trudeau the Elder, so I totally agree with his approach. That being, and I also agree with you sometimes that, and I agree with the witness that there's a double standard with this bill, and if we start naming Iran, if we were to name every country with which we have questions of conflict, we'd have a long list. That being said, that's more a question not to you, but to the chair. En principe, Monsieur le Président.
Chair, I have the e-petition here before me. When a private organization appears before a committee, in my opinion, sharing it out in one language isn't insulting. When it's a government organization, then we have to make sure there is bilingualism. I don't want to comment on behalf of my Francophone colleagues, but sharing a document in one language is okay with consent. I think that we have consent. I don't know what Senator Housakis has to say, but when it's an e-petition, in any case, that is already available on Parliament's website in French, then we must note that this petition was already available in French online. Just a comment, because often we do not have a certain piece of information. And this is a document signed by 15,000 Canadians, a very germane petition and document to our debate. I would like to reiterate that, yes, I do agree that there are double standards here. I am slightly worried when suddenly we are admonishing countries and that we are tabling bills for each and every single country. Thank you, Senator Dawson, for your comments. It is duly noted.
Just make a quick comment. I agree with you. When we were printing, because we actually printed the electronic petitions, they're available on the Parliament, the website, the Parliament of Canada, in both official languages. When we were printing them, where my assistant was printing it, she was under the belief that it would print both languages. However, when I brought it here, I realized that it's only in English and not available in French. However, I fully agree with you that it has to be available and it has to be provided in both official languages. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Senator Go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do apologize for arriving late. And again, if my question has been asked already, please feel free to say so. This committee has heard evidence that individuals supported by, in many cases, the government or its institutions have engaged in serious human rights violations. And we've had this evidence. And at the same time, we've also heard, and I totally agree, that as a government we need to engage and talk. And indeed, one of the victims of human rights violations was of the same view before this committee. So my question is this. Should Canada have the tools to take action against individuals who may have perpetrated serious human rights abuses against their citizens, Iranian citizens, in areas like their ability to come to Canada or visas to come to Canada, or how we might deal with their assets, whether real property or other in Canada? So you'll appreciate I'm asking a question that is not directly addressed by the legislation, but I want to know whether your organization, which represents Iranian Canadians, believes that those individuals in Iran who may have committed gross human rights violations against their individuals should be, this is not the right word, immune or free from any possibility that Canada would limit their access to the country or their use of their assets once here. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. First of all, there is already another bill, I believe, in front of this committee, which addresses specifically this question that you brought up. I'm not, again, I have to repeat that I'm not, and we're not aware of the details of, we didn't study the details of that bill. And we do not have the legal expertise that is required to, for example, say that, okay, international law already has some authority with respect to actually bringing people who have committed serious human rights violations to justice. So there are already international laws with respect to that. But we do not have the legal expertise to comment on this issue that much. I believe that the issue should be with the details, that any bill that includes your suggestion, we have to look at the details of how these individuals are going to be, is it evidence-based, what we're asking for, or is it only based on reports from a couple of nonprofit organizations? If it's evidence-based, if it's fact-based, and if those actions, those sanctions or bans, etc., are not going to affect the people instead of those individuals, then the answer can be yes. But again, as I said, it really needs to be studied with all the details before we really can comment and provide our opinion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Gold. And to wrap it up, the last question will go to Senator Usakos.
And I will be very succinct because I appreciate the testimony of the witnesses today, but I think from the beginning and throughout the process, I think a couple of senators have tried to get an answer to this question, and you haven't given one, but I'll be succinct. I think your argument about the importance of engagement is understood. Can you tell me, though, what is your benchmark? And again, at what point you decide to disengage with a party or a state when things are not obviously heading towards the direction that you think is that happy medium? Because when you engage with somebody, you want to meet at a certain point. Can you define that point, and at what point do you disengage?
Senator, if we want to look at those benchmarks, I understood your question completely, but I believe that that double standard, we really need to think about it with respect to your question. Because if we really want to only talk to people we agree with and meet our benchmarks and our values, then we first actually have to disengage and break our relations with many of the countries that have serious human rights violations issues and are not respecting human rights. So that will be the first step if we want to follow the strategy that you're suggesting, or strategy that the former government implemented. The benchmarks have to be decided, as the other honorable senator mentioned, by our foreign affairs ministry, and our diplomats. During the negotiations, they will be able to set these benchmarks. Our EU allies, our European allies, are already talking to Iran about human rights. They are having these conversations. So what we're asking for is Canada will have an opportunity to join our allies in these conversations about human rights and raise our concerns with them. That, we believe, is a better path instead of the status quo of not being engaged with Iran.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator Gold. Yes, I think, no? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ahmadi and Mr. Tabasinjead. Thank you for your presentation. You can see that all senators are getting involved in this kind of subject, and then I thank all senators, and the meeting is adjourned.